Nobody in America expected the turning point to come from a place most of them had never seen. A dusty trading post in rural Africa where local merchants quietly decided they were done being pushed around. For decades, they had swallowed rules written an ocean away. They had played by systems they never helped design. But one morning, before the sun had even burned off the mist on the red clay roads, they made a choice that would ripple through grocery aisles in Ohio, diners in Texas, and quiet living rooms across Florida. They refused to send their crops under the old price rules, and that simple refusal cracked open a global supply chain the United States had relied on for half a century. People in America didn't feel it immediately. Not at first. Life went on. Retirees brewed their morning coffee. Young people grabbed snacks on their way to class. Shelves still looked full. The system had been so big, so powerful for so long, it seemed unshakable. But underneath that calm surface, a storm was brewing, quiet, invisible, and ignored by the people who could have stopped it. The world was changing, Africa was changing, and America hadn't been paying attention. The United States had always treated Africa as a bargain basement for raw materials. Cheap cocoa, cheap cotton, cheap grains, cheap everything. The logic was simple. Africa produced, America profited. But the world never stays still. For years, African farmers had watched their own children grow up, longing for the lives they saw online. They watched foreign corporations grow richer while their own regions stayed poor. Eventually, they began building their own factories, hiring their own engineers, and imagining futures where they didn't ship wealth outward anymore. But the moment they tried to raise the prices to reflect their actual value, they met the old hammer: higher tariffs, tighter restrictions, and pressure to stay in their place. This time, however, they didn't bend. A coalition of African nations made a landmark decision to process more goods domestically. No more sending raw cocoa for pennies so someone else could turn it into chocolate worth dollars. No more exporting cotton only to buy back expensive clothes. They would process it all at home. It was bold, it was risky, and it was the first time in generations they stood as equal players rather than silent suppliers. For Africa, it was liberation. For American corporations, it was a threat. The fallout hit slowly, then all at once. It started with chocolate, something small, something most people never thought about. A few dollars difference. A missing brand temporarily. But within weeks, other products followed. Prices rose beyond what older Americans remembered from their childhoods. The grocery store no longer felt familiar. The dollar stretched thinner every week. Younger people shrugged at first, thinking it was just inflation. Older generations felt uneasy. They had lived long enough to recognize the tremor before the earthquake. Behind closed doors, executives panicked. Their factories were built on old assumptions. Their margins depended on cheap African supplies. Without them, costs exploded. They had two choices: pay Africa's new fair prices or reshape everything about how they operated. Neither option was easy. Some companies tried to bully their way back into the old system. They demanded the US government intervene more aggressively, impose harsher penalties, even threaten diplomatic consequences. But the world was no longer in an era where one nation could dictate terms. Africa had trading partners everywhere: China, India, Brazil, the Middle East, nations eager to collaborate on equal terms. America was not the only customer anymore. As the pressure mounted, the impact spread to ordinary families. Retired couples who once had predictable grocery budgets found themselves recalculating every purchase. Parents told kids no to snacks they once bought without thinking. Restaurants rewrote menus. Landscapes of American life began to shift, one small sacrifice at a time. But the deeper shock was emotional. For decades, America had felt untouchable, the center of the world. Now, it felt like the world was moving on, without asking for permission. The youth felt it differently. They saw opportunity in the chaos. Young entrepreneurs imagined new industries, homegrown replacements, and sustainable farming within the US. They talked about independence from fragile global chains. They believed America could innovate again, not by squeezing other nations, but by building better systems. The older generation, however, often felt betrayed. They had lived through eras where America dictated the rules. Watching that era fade was unsettling, even painful. The country felt unfamiliar, and many feared it would never be the same again. Meanwhile, Africa's transformation accelerated. African factories, powered by local workers and modern technology, produced chocolate, clothing, processed foods, and packaged goods with pride. For the first time, the labels didn't read raw material origin. They read Made in Africa. Wealth began to circulate where it had once only bled out. Roads were paved. Schools expanded. Young Africans saw futures at home rather than abroad. The narrative shifted from the poorest continent to the rising powerhouse. And with that rise came a global recalibration. Economists in America warned that resisting Africa's growth was like fighting the tide. The world order was simply evolving. But politics often reacts slower than reality. Instead of adapting, American leadership doubled down on tariffs, hoping pressure would force Africa back into the old patterns. But tariffs only pushed Africa closer to the nations that offered respect instead of demands. And so the United States found itself isolated not by weakness, but by stubbornness. The deeper truth was that the American system had been built on predictability. Everything from grocery stores to school lunch programs to small-town diners relied on the assumption that overseas producers would accept low compensation forever. The moment that foundation cracked, the entire structure began to wobble. It wasn't just about cocoa or cotton. It was about the belief that America could stay the dominant voice in every global conversation. Back in the homes of ordinary Americans, people tried to make sense of what was happening. Older citizens reminisced about times when things felt simpler, when a dollar bought more, when the world seemed stable. But they also saw their grandchildren entering a world that demanded new thinking, new solutions, new respect for global partners. Youth didn't carry the nostalgia of dominance. They carried the ambition of reinvention. As months passed, something unexpected began to emerge. Instead of collapsing under pressure, America started innovating. Local farming cooperatives grew. Young engineers designed machines to process crops domestically. Small towns revived long-abandoned factories. Older Americans, with decades of experience, shared wisdom with younger workers eager to build something of their own. Communities began forming alliances with sustainable growers, urban gardens, and regional supply networks. Slowly, a new American ecosystem took shape, not dependent on exploitation, but driven by collaboration and resilience. And while the government still clung to outdated strategies, the American people adapted faster than anyone expected. They adjusted recipes, supported local brands, bought directly from farmers, and started seeing scarcity not as a threat, but as a challenge to overcome. This blend of nostalgia and innovation, the wisdom of age combined with the ambition of youth, became America's quiet advantage. On the other side of the world, Africa noticed. They saw that America's younger generation wasn't hostile. They were curious. They wanted fair trade, not dominance. They wanted partnership, not pressure. And for the first time, African leaders saw an America that could be a collaborator instead of a controller. This shift didn't happen through political speeches or breaking news. It happened through thousands of small decisions made by ordinary people on both continents. It happened through businesses that listened instead of demanded, through communities that adapted instead of panicked, through young people who refused to inherit outdated rivalries, and through older Americans who understood that survival has always required humility, flexibility, and respect, lessons life had taught them many times. In the end, the global story wasn't about Africa rising or America falling. It was about the world resetting itself into a fairer balance. Africa grew stronger not to overshadow America, but to claim its rightful place. America adjusted not because it was forced to, but because ordinary citizens refused to give up. The shift that began in a dusty marketplace ended in a world where partnerships mattered more than power. The chaos became clarity. The tension became opportunity. And the story, one that started with fear and resistance, became a testament to how nations, like people, can grow when they choose understanding over dominance. America and Africa, once locked in an unbalanced exchange, now stood on the threshold of a new era. where equality didn't mean loss, but possibility. And the families in both continents, young and old, would one day look back at this moment not as the collapse of a system, but as the beginning of a better one. A world where respect replaced control, where value was recognized, and where even the smallest voices could reshape the global order. It all started with a refusal and ended with a rebalance neither side could have imagined, but both sides needed.